The thunder rolled across the valley like a warning as Grace Ziegler stared out into the darkness, her heart pounding against her ribs when she discovered the empty beds. Her children Daniel, aged 6, and Emma, just 4, were gone, their blankets strewn across the floor, the window left ajar. The note pinned to Daniel's pillow bore Frank's unmistakable scrawl. "They're my flesh and blood, too. You'll never find us." Grace sank to her knees, clutching the paper until it crumpled in her fist. The divorce had been finalized just 3 weeks prior, after 2 years of Frank's increasingly erratic behavior. The drinking, the gambling debts, and the threats that had eventually driven her to seek the protection of the law. Judge Harmon had granted her full custody of the children, something almost unheard of in 1878 Amarillo, Texas. Frank had stormed out of the courthouse, his face twisted with rage, swearing revenge, and now he had taken them. Dawn found Grace at Sheriff Wilson's office, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, her normally neat chestnut hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. "Mrs. Ziegler, I sympathize with your situation, truly I do," Sheriff Wilson said, stroking his graying mustache, "but Frank hasn't broken any laws. He's their father." "He has no legal right to them," Grace insisted, placing the court documents on his desk with trembling hands. "The judge gave me full custody." The sheriff sighed, glancing at the papers without touching them. "That may be so, but I don't have the men to send after him. The Callahan gang hit another stagecoach yesterday, and I've got 3 deputies out tracking them. So you'll do nothing." Grace's voice rose, desperation coloring every word. Sheriff Wilson leaned forward. "I'll send telegrams to the neighboring towns, but Frank knows these parts well. If he doesn't want to be found." Grace stood, gathering her documents. "Then I'll find someone who can find them." She walked out into the dusty street, the morning sun already heating the air. Amarillo had grown significantly since the railroad had come through, but it was still a frontier town at heart. The main street bustled with morning activity shopkeepers opening their doors, freight wagons delivering goods, cowboys fresh off the trail looking for breakfast and whiskey. Not necessarily in that order. Grace headed toward the general store, which also housed the town's small post office. As she approached, she noticed a tall figure dismounting from a magnificent black stallion. The man's face was partially hidden beneath the wide brim of his hat, but there was something in his bearing that made her pause. He moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to handling himself in dangerous situations. The stranger tied his horse to the hitching post and turned, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He couldn't have been more than 35, with a clean-shaven jaw and brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore simple trail clothes, a faded blue shirt, denim trousers, and worn leather boots, but the gun belt around his waist was polished and well-maintained, the mark of a man who understood that his life might one day depend on that weapon. As if sensing her scrutiny, he glanced her way. Grace quickly looked down, embarrassed to be caught staring, but not before she noticed the way his expression softened when he saw her distress. Inside the general store, Mr. Peterson looked up from arranging canned goods. "Grace, my word, what's happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Frank took the children last night," she said, her voice breaking. "The sheriff won't help. I need to send telegrams, find someone who can track them down." Mr. Peterson's wife emerged from the back room, her face creased with concern. "Those poor little ones. That man should be horsewhipped." The bell above the door jingled as the stranger entered, removing his hat and nodding politely to the room. Up close, Grace could see the tiny scars that marked his knuckles and the careful way he positioned himself with his back to the wall, eyes constantly moving. "Pardon me," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. "I couldn't help overhearing. Your husband took your children." Ex-husband, Grace corrected automatically. "And yes, despite having no legal right to them." The stranger nodded thoughtfully. "I'm sorry to hear that, madam. Patrick Redmond," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "Some folks call me Red." "Grace Ziegler," she replied, shaking his hand briefly. "Do you know this area well, Mr. Redmond?" "I've ridden through most of the territory," he said. "Been tracking for the army, for ranchers, for anyone who needs something or someone found." Hope fluttered in Grace's chest. "Could you find my children?" Patrick studied her for a long moment. "I could try. But I should warn you it won't be cheap, and I can't guarantee success." "I don't have much money," Grace admitted. "But I own a small ranch outside town. It's not much, but it's paid for. I'd give anything to have my children back." Patrick rubbed his jaw. "Tell me about your ex-husband. Where might he go? Does he have family, friends, particular haunts?" For the next hour, Grace laid out everything she knew about Frank's habits, his connections, his favorite hideouts when they were still married. Frank had worked as a cattle driver, knew many of the trails and hidden water sources across Texas and into the territories. He had a brother in New Mexico and cousins scattered across Arizona. Patrick listened carefully, occasionally asking a question but mostly just absorbing the information. When she finished, he nodded decisively. "I'll need something of your children, something with their scent. And a recent photograph, if you have one." "I have a daguerreotype taken just last month," Grace said, reaching into her reticule. "And I can bring you one of Daniel's shirts and Emma's blanket." Patrick looked at the photograph, a solemn-faced boy with his mother's eyes, and a little girl with wild curls and a missing front tooth. "They're good-looking children," he said softly. "They're everything to me," Grace whispered. Patrick handed the photograph back. "I'll need supplies before I set out. Can you meet me back here in an hour with their things?" Grace nodded, a weight lifting from her shoulders. She wasn't naive. She knew this man was no knight in shining armor, but he was offering what no one else had: action. "How will you find them?" she asked. Patrick's eyes hardened slightly. "Your ex-husband will leave tracks, Mrs. Ziegler, not just physical ones but patterns. Men like him are creatures of habit, even when they're running." He hesitated, then added, "I should tell you that once I find them, getting your children back might not be pretty. Frank won't give them up willingly." "I understand," Grace said, though a small part of her wondered if she truly did. "Just bring them home safely, please." True to her word, Grace returned in an hour with a small cloth bundle containing Daniel's favorite shirt and the corner of Emma's beloved blanket. She had also packed some provisions: bread, jerky, and a canteen of water. "I thought you might need these for the journey," she said, handing the food to Patrick, who was now outfitted with additional ammunition and what looked like tracking equipment. "Thank you," he said, packing them efficiently into his saddlebags. "I've studied the map and asked around town. Word is, a man matching Frank's description was seen headed west with 2 small children before dawn. They had a day's start, but he's traveling with young ones. That'll slow him down." "How long do you think it will take?" Grace asked, trying to keep the anxiety from her voice. "Hard to say. Could be a few days, could be weeks if he's clever, but I've tracked men through worse country than this." Grace nodded, swallowing hard. "What do you need from me now?" "A place to find you when I return," Patrick said. "And patience." "The ranch is 3 miles east of town, just past Willow Creek. There's a sign at the turnoff Ziegler Ranch." She hesitated, then added, "I'll be waiting every day." Patrick mounted his horse, securing the bundle with the children's belongings to his saddle. "I'll bring them back, Mrs. Ziegler." "You have my word." As he turned to leave, Grace called after him, "Mr. Redmond, What makes you so sure you can find them when the sheriff won't even try? Patrick looked back, his expression grim. Because I understand men like Frank. I've hunted far worse through these territories. He touched the brim of his hat. And because some things are worth fighting for. With that, he nudged his horse forward and rode out of town, following the western trail where Frank and the children had last been seen. The first day of Patrick's tracking went quickly. Frank had made no real effort to hide his trail, confident in his head start. The tracks of his horse, burdened with the extra weight of 2 children, were clear in the soft earth of the trail. By nightfall, Patrick had covered nearly 30 miles, pushing his horse as hard as he dared in the heat. He made camp in a small grove of cottonwoods near a stream, allowing his mount to rest while he studied the tracks he'd been following. Frank had left the main trail about 10 miles back, veering northwest toward the more rugged country. It was a smart move, fewer people, more places to hide, but it also told Patrick something about Frank's state of mind. He was planning for a long journey, not just a quick escape. As he sat by his small fire, Patrick unwrapped the bundle Grace had given him. He held Daniel's shirt carefully, noting the careful mending around one cuff, then touched the fragment of Emma's blanket, worn soft with love and countless washings. He tried to imagine the fear these children must be feeling, torn from their beds in the night by a father they likely feared more than loved. Patrick had seen the remnants of bruises on Grace's wrist when she'd handed him the bundle, faded but still visible. She hadn't mentioned abuse in their conversation, but she didn't need to. Patrick had seen enough in his years of tracking to recognize the signs. His mind drifted back to Grace Ziegler. Despite her obvious distress, there had been a quiet strength about her, a determination that he admired. She wasn't a conventional beauty, but there was something arresting about her green eyes and the way she held herself with dignity even in her desperation. Patrick shook his head, dismissing the thought. He needed to focus on the task at hand. Romance had no place in his life, not with the work he did, not with the demons he carried. The last time he'd allowed himself to care for a woman, it had ended badly for both of them. He'd learned his lesson. But as he rolled himself in his blanket beneath the stars, his last thoughts were not of the trail ahead, but of a pair of determined green eyes and the promise he'd made. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the kind of relentless Texas heat that shimmered above the ground by midday. Patrick started early, following the increasingly deliberate trail Frank was leaving. The man had begun to take precautions, crossing rocky areas where tracks would be harder to follow, doubling back occasionally to check if he was being pursued. By afternoon, Patrick came across the remains of a campsite, ashes still warm, a child's small handprint pressed into the mud by the creek, and a torn piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush that matched the color of the dress Emma wore in the daguerreotype. He was getting closer. As the day wore on, the landscape changed, becoming more broken with mesas and dry arroyos. Good country to lose a pursuer, but dangerous territory for small children. Patrick pushed on until dusk, finally making camp when his horse could go no further. That night, a dust storm blew in from the west, forcing Patrick to seek shelter in the lee of a rocky outcropping. He wrapped a bandana around his face and huddled against the stinging particles, thinking of the children out in this weather. The storm would erase tracks, making his job harder, but it would also slow Frank down, especially with 2 young children to protect. When dawn broke, the air was clear again, but as Patrick had feared, much of the trail had been obliterated by the blowing sand. He spent 2 hours in an ever-widening circle from his camp, searching for any sign of Frank's passage. Finally, he found a horseshoe print pressed deep into a patch of clay protected by an overhanging rock. The track was fresh no more than a few hours old. Frank had passed during the night, pushing through the storm in his desperation to put distance between himself and any pursuers. Patrick mounted quickly, following the direction of the print. By midday, he spotted a plume of dust on the horizon, moving slowly toward the distant mountains. Through his field glass, he could make out a single rider with two small figures clinging to the saddle. Patrick's pulse quickened. He had them in sight now, but a direct confrontation in open country would put the children at risk. He would have to bide his time and wait for the right moment. Back at the Ziegler ranch, Grace moved through her days in a fog of anxiety and determination. She tended the small herd of cattle, fed the chickens, repaired fences, all the tasks she'd done alongside Frank before his decline, and then alone after he'd abandoned them for the saloons and gambling halls. But every few hours, she would stop and scan the horizon, hoping to see riders approaching. Each night, she lit a lantern and placed it in the window facing the trail, a beacon for her children and the man she'd entrusted to find them. On the fourth day after Patrick's departure, Grace was in town buying supplies when she overheard a conversation between two cowboys fresh off the trail. "Heard there was a shootout near the Johnson place," one was saying. "Man with two kids being chased by some gunslinger. Johnson said they headed into the Badlands after that." Grace's heart seemed to stop. She abandoned her shopping and rushed to the men. "Please," she said. "The man with the children, what did he look like?" The cowboys exchanged glances. "Didn't see him myself, madam," the taller one said. "Just repeating what I heard." "And the gunslinger," Grace pressed. "Was he hurt? Did anyone see if the children were safe?" "Can't say for sure," the cowboy replied uncomfortably. "Just trail talk." Grace hurried to the sheriff's office but found it empty except for a young deputy who knew nothing of any reports of gunfire. Frustrated and terrified, she returned to the ranch, unable to shake the image of her children caught in a crossfire between their father and the man she'd hired. That night, she barely slept, pacing the floor of her small home until exhaustion forced her to rest. When she did sleep, her dreams were filled with gunshots and the cries of her children. The following morning, Grace was splitting wood for the kitchen stove when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She dropped the axe and ran to the front of the house, shading her eyes against the sun. A rider was approaching slowly, leading a second horse. As they drew closer, Grace's heart sank. It was Patrick Redmond, but he was alone, his shirt stained with what appeared to be blood, his face grim. "Mr. Redmond," she called, running toward him. "My children, they're safe, Mrs. Ziegler," he said quickly, dismounting with a slight wince. "They're at Dr. Miller's in town. I wanted to make sure they were unharmed before bringing them home." Relief flooded through Grace so intensely that her knees buckled. Patrick caught her arm, steadying her. "What happened?" she asked, looking up into his weary face. "Are they hurt? There were rumors in town about gunfire." Patrick guided her to the porch steps and helped her sit. "There was some trouble," he admitted. "I caught up to Frank near the border with New Mexico. He'd been pushing hard, barely stopping to rest. The children were exhausted. Did you have to?" Grace couldn't bring herself to finish the question. Patrick's expression hardened. "I tried to reason with him first, offered him the chance to give the children up peacefully." He sighed. "He drew on me instead." "Did you kill him?" Grace whispered. "No," Patrick said, "though not for lack of trying on his part. He's wounded, shot in the shoulder, but alive. I left him at the sheriff's office in Adobe Wells. He'll stand trial for kidnapping and attempted murder." Grace closed her eyes briefly. Despite everything, she couldn't wish death on the father of her children. "Thank you for sparing him." "Wasn't my intention," Patrick said honestly. "But when the shooting started, Daniel broke free and ran between us. I had to dive to get him out of the line of fire, changed my aim." He touched his side gingerly. "Caught one of Frank's bullets in the process, but it's just a graze." "You're injured," Grace exclaimed, noticing the bloodstain on his shirt for the first time. "Let me tend to it." Patrick shook his head. "Doctor already patched me up in town. I'm fine." "The children," Grace said, standing suddenly. "I need to go to them." "They're resting," Patrick said gently. "Doc gave them something to help them sleep, said they were dehydrated and exhausted but otherwise unharmed. He'll send word when they wake." Grace sank back onto the step, emotions overwhelming her. "I can't believe you found them so quickly. How can I ever repay you?" "We agreed on terms," Patrick said, somewhat uncomfortably. "But seeing those kids safe is payment enough." Grace studied him, seeing beyond the tough exterior to the man beneath, a man who had risked his life for children he didn't know, who had shown restraint when it would have been easier to kill. "You must be exhausted too," she said. "Please, come inside. Let me offer you a meal at least." Patrick hesitated, then nodded. "I could eat." Inside the small but tidy ranch house, Grace busied herself preparing a substantial meal: beans, cornbread, and the last of the ham she'd been saving for Sunday dinner. As she worked, Patrick sat at the kitchen table, his hat on his knee, looking curiously around the home. "You've done well with this place," he commented. "Running a ranch alone isn't easy, especially for—" He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "For a woman." Grace finished with a small smile. "No, it isn't. But I grew up on a farm in Missouri. My father taught me and my brothers everything he knew. When I married Frank and we came west, I was the one who knew how to birth a calf and mend fences." "What brought you to Amarillo?" Patrick asked, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. Grace's smile faded. "Frank had dreams of making it big in cattle. We pooled our savings and bought this place." She glanced around the kitchen. "It was run down then, but the land was good. We worked hard those first 2 years, built it into something." "What changed?" Grace sat across from him, cradling her own coffee. "Frank started drinking. At first just Saturday nights in town, then more often. He'd come home angry, looking for someone to blame for his failures." She touched her wrist unconsciously. "After Daniel was born, things got worse. By the time Emma came along, he was gambling away our profits, disappearing for days at a time." "That's when you decided to divorce him," Grace nodded. "I realized one night, when he came home drunk and started shouting at Daniel for crying, that I was more afraid of what he might do to the children than I was of facing the scandal of divorce." She met Patrick's eyes steadily. "Some things are worth fighting for, as you said." Patrick held her gaze, something like respect kindling in his blue eyes. "You're a brave woman, Mrs. Ziegler." "Grace," she corrected him. "After what you've done for my family, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Grace," he repeated softly, as if testing the sound of her name. The moment was broken by the sizzle of fat hitting the fire as Grace turned back to the stove. They ate in companionable silence, Patrick clearly famished from his journey. When he'd finished, he leaned back in his chair with a satisfied sigh. "Best meal I've had in months," he said. "Thank you." "It's the least I could do," Grace replied, gathering the plates. "Will you stay in Amarillo long?" Patrick's expression grew guarded. "No. Once I know the children are settled back home safely, I'll be moving on. That's my way." Grace felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "Of course. I'm sure you have other work waiting." "Usually do," he agreed, though he didn't sound particularly enthusiastic about it. A knock at the door startled them both. Grace hurried to answer it, finding Doc Miller's teenage son on the porch. "Ma says to tell you the little ones are awake and asking for their mama," the boy announced importantly. "Thank you, Billy," Grace said, already reaching for her shawl. She turned to Patrick, who had followed her to the door. "I have to go to them." "Of course," he said. "I'll ride with you." The journey into town was swift, Grace barely able to contain her impatience. When they arrived at the doctor's house, she practically leapt from the saddle, rushing inside while Patrick tended to the horses. The reunion was everything Grace had dreamed of during those agonizing days of separation. Daniel and Emma flew into her arms, both talking at once, their small bodies warm and vital against hers. She held them tightly, tears flowing freely as she whispered reassurances and endearments. "Mama, the bad men tried to shoot Daddy," Daniel said, his eyes wide. "But Mr. Red jumped like this," he demonstrated with a dramatic dive across the bed, "and saved me. He has a real big horse," Emma added solemnly, "and he let me hold his hat." Grace looked up to see Patrick standing in the doorway, watching the scene with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Children," she said gently, "this is Mr. Redmond. He brought you home to me." Daniel regarded Patrick seriously. "Are you going to be our new daddy now?" Patrick looked startled while Grace felt heat rush to her face. "Daniel," she admonished, "that's not an appropriate question." "But you said our old daddy had to go away because he was mean," Emma reasoned. "Mr. Red isn't mean. He gave us jerky and told us stories about buffalo." Patrick cleared his throat. "I'm just a friend who helped your mama find you," he said carefully. "That's all." Doc Miller's wife, a kind but no-nonsense woman, chose that moment to intervene. "These children need rest," she declared. "They can go home tomorrow if they sleep well tonight." Grace kissed her children good night, promising to return first thing in the morning. As she and Patrick left the doctor's house, an awkward silence fell between them. "I'm sorry about what Daniel said," Grace finally offered as they walked their horses down the quiet street toward the hotel where Patrick had taken a room. "Children don't understand adult relationships." Patrick gave a short laugh. "No need to apologize. It's natural for them to wonder, I suppose." They stopped outside the hotel, neither seeming eager to end the conversation despite the lateness of the hour. "Will you come to the ranch tomorrow?" Grace asked. "The children would like to say a proper goodbye, I'm sure." Patrick hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." "Good night then, Mr. Redmond." "Patrick," he corrected with the hint of a smile. "After what we've been through, I think we can dispense with formalities." Grace smiled back, a strange flutter in her chest. "Good night, Patrick." The next morning, Doc Miller pronounced the children fit to travel, though he cautioned that they should rest for a few days at home. Grace had brought the wagon into town, making a comfortable nest of blankets in the back for Daniel and Emma. To her surprise, Patrick was waiting outside the doctor's house when they emerged, his horse saddled and ready. "Thought I'd ride escort," he explained, "just to be safe." The children were delighted to see him, bombarding him with questions about his adventures as the small party made its way back to the ranch. Patrick answered with good-natured patience, crafting his responses to entertain while carefully omitting the more violent aspects of his profession. At the ranch, Grace settled the children in the house while Patrick tended to the animals. When she came outside to thank him, she found him repairing a loose board on the porch steps. "You don't have to do that," she said. Patrick shrugged. "Saw it needed fixing. I'm good with my hands." "So I've noticed," Grace replied, then blushed at how the words sounded. "I mean, you've been very helpful." Patrick straightened, wiping his brow. "It's nothing. How are they settling in?" "Well enough. Emma's already asking when she can help with the chickens again. Daniel's a bit more quiet. I think the experience affected him more deeply." "He's a brave boy," Patrick said. When the shooting started, his first thought was to protect his sister, try to get to her even though Frank was holding her. Grace's heart swelled with pride and ached with sorrow simultaneously. He shouldn't have had to be so brave, not at his age. "No," Patrick agreed, "but the world doesn't always give us what we should have." He looked out across the ranch, his expression distant. Sometimes we have to make do with what we get. Is that what you've done? Grace asked softly. Made do? Patrick's eyes returned to her face, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. I suppose so. Never stayed in one place long enough to find out if there might be more. And now, the question hung between them, loaded with possibility. Before Patrick could answer, Daniel appeared at the door. Mama, Emma's crying. She says her blanket isn't right. The moment broken, Grace hurried inside to comfort her daughter, explaining gently that the piece torn from her beloved blanket had been necessary to help find her. By the time Emma was calmed and both children settled for a nap, Grace returned outside to find Patrick saddling his horse. You're leaving, she said, unable to keep the disappointment from her voice. Best to move on, he replied, not meeting her eyes. Frank may have friends who won't take kindly to what happened. Is that the real reason? Grace challenged, moving closer. Patrick's hand stilled on the saddle strap. No, he admitted quietly, being here with you and the children, it makes me think about things I've spent years avoiding. What things? A home, family, putting down roots. He turned to face her. My life isn't set up for that, Grace. I go where I'm needed, do what others can't or won't. It's not a life I can share. Maybe it could be, Grace suggested, her heart racing at her own boldness. Maybe you've just never had a reason to try. Patrick took a step toward her, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jawline, smell the leather and pine scent of him. Are you offering me a reason, Grace Ziegler? I'm suggesting you might find one here, she answered carefully, if you stayed long enough to look. For a moment she thought he might kiss her. His eyes dropped to her lips and she felt herself sway slightly toward him. Then he stepped back, creating distance between them. I've agreed to track a stage robber for the express office in Fort Worth, he said, his voice rough. I gave my word. Grace nodded, swallowing her disappointment. I understand. You're a man of honor. I don't know about that, Patrick said with a self-deprecating smile, but I do try to keep my promises. He mounted his horse with fluid grace. Take care of those children. They're lucky to have a mother like you. Goodbye, Patrick, Grace said, stepping back as he turned his horse toward the trail. Thank you for bringing them home. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture she was coming to find endearing. Goodbye, Grace. She watched until he disappeared over the rise, then turned back to the house where her children slept, telling herself that the ache in her chest was simply relief that her family was whole again. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity as Grace and the children settled back into their routine. Daniel had nightmares at first, waking in terror, convinced that his father was trying to take him away again. Grace would hold him until he fell back asleep, whispering assurances that he was safe, that no one would ever take him from her again. Emma, surprisingly, seemed less traumatized by the experience. She talked about the adventure with Mr. Red as if it had been a grand expedition rather than a terrifying kidnapping. Her resilience was a balm to Grace's worried heart. News came from Adobe Wells that Frank had been sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison for kidnapping and attempted murder. The judge had been particularly harsh given Frank's violation of the custody order and his shooting at Patrick with children present. Grace received the news with mixed emotions: relief that Frank couldn't threaten them again for a long time, sadness for the man she had once loved, and concern for how to explain their father's imprisonment to the children. Throughout it all, her thoughts kept returning to Patrick. She found herself watching the trail each evening, hoping to see his tall figure approaching. She knew it was foolish he had made his position clear, but her heart refused to listen to reason. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after Patrick's departure, Grace was in the garden harvesting late summer vegetables when Daniel came running from the pasture. "Riders coming, Mama," he shouted. Pointing toward the western ridge, Grace straightened, shading her eyes against the sun. 3 horsemen were approaching, still too distant to identify. Her first thought was Patrick, but she quickly dismissed it. He would be alone, not with companions. "Go inside with your sister," she said to Daniel, her voice calm but firm. "Stay there until I call you." Once the children were safely in the house, Grace retrieved the shotgun from above the fireplace and stepped onto the porch, the weapon held ready but not raised. As the riders drew closer, she recognized the middle figure as Sheriff Wilson, flanked by 2 deputies. Relief flooded through her as she lowered the shotgun. "Sheriff," she called as they rode into the yard. "What brings you out this way?" Sheriff Wilson dismounted, his expression grave. "Mrs. Ziegler, I'm afraid I have some disturbing news." Grace's heart stuttered. "What is it? Is it Frank?" "Has he escaped?" "No, madam, it's about Redmond." The sheriff removed his hat. "We received a telegraph from Fort Worth yesterday. Seems he ran into trouble while tracking those stage robbers." "Is he hurt?" Grace asked, clutching the porch railing. "He's alive," the sheriff said carefully. "But it's serious. Took 2 bullets, one in the leg, another in his side. Doctors in Fort Worth did what they could, but they're not optimistic." Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "I need to go to him," she said, already calculating what arrangements would need to be made. Sheriff Wilson looked surprised. "Mrs. Ziegler, Fort Worth is a good 3 days hard travel, and with the children, I'll find a way," she interrupted. "Sheriff, that man saved my children. I owe him this much at least." The sheriff exchanged glances with his deputies. "Well, as it happens, that's partly why I'm here. Redmond's being transported back to Amarillo tomorrow on the train. Doc Miller agreed to take over his care since he's familiar with gunshot wounds from the war." "Why Amarillo?" Grace asked, confused. "Does he have family here?" "No, madam. According to the telegraph, he specifically asked to be brought here. Said something about a promise he needed to keep." Grace's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. A promise. The night before he left, she had suggested he might find a reason to stay if he looked hard enough. Had he been coming back to her all along? "When will the train arrive?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil of emotions inside her. "Noon tomorrow. We'll have a wagon waiting to transport him to Doc's place." "I'll be there," Grace said firmly. The sheriff nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "Thought you might say that. We'll see you in town then." After the sheriff and his deputies departed, Grace sat on the porch steps, her mind racing. Patrick was coming back to Amarillo to her, but he was gravely injured. She might still lose him before she ever truly had him. Inside, she found the children playing quietly with the wooden animals Patrick had carved for them during their journey home. "Who was it, Mama?" Daniel asked, looking up from his game. "Sheriff Wilson," Grace replied, sitting down beside them. "Children, I need to tell you something important. Mr. Redmond has been hurt. He's coming back to Amarillo tomorrow, and I'm going to town to see him." "Is he going to die?" Emma asked with a child's blunt curiosity. Grace smoothed her daughter's curls. "I hope not, sweetheart. The doctors are doing everything they can to help him." "Can we come too?" Daniel wanted to know. "I made him a picture. Not tomorrow," Grace said gently, "but soon, I promise. Mrs. Johnson is going to stay with you while I'm in town." That evening, after the children were asleep, Grace sat at her small writing desk and composed a letter to Patrick, pouring out the feelings she had been too cautious to express when he was standing before her. Whether he lived or died, she wanted him to know what was in her heart. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a welcome respite from the summer heat. Grace dressed with care in her best dress, a simple blue cotton with white trim, and arranged her hair in a neat chignon. Mrs. Johnson arrived early, full of questions about that handsome tracker and his injuries, which Grace answered with as much patience as she could muster. In town, a small crowd had gathered at the train station. News traveled fast in Amarillo, and Patrick's rescue of the Ziegler children had made him something of a local hero. Grace made her way through the onlookers to where Sheriff Wilson stood near the platform. "Train's running on time for once," he informed her. "Should be here any minute." Grace nodded, her throat too tight with anxiety to speak. The wait seemed interminable, though in reality it was only a few minutes before the distant whistle announced the train's approach. As the locomotive pulled into the station in a cloud of steam and noise, Grace steeled herself for what she might find. The sheriff had been deliberately vague about Patrick's condition, but the fact that he needed to be transported by stretcher rather than sitting upright spoke volumes. Two men emerged from the passenger car, carefully maneuvering a stretcher between them. Grace caught her first glimpse of Patrick and had to stifle a gasp. His face was pale and drawn, his body unnaturally still beneath the blanket. A doctor followed, carrying a medical bag and speaking rapidly to Doc Miller, who had come forward to meet the train. Grace moved closer, her eyes never leaving Patrick's face. As if sensing her presence, his eyelids flickered open, revealing the blue eyes that had haunted her dreams. "Grace," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the station noise. She was at his side in an instant, taking his hand. "I'm here," she said, tears threatening. "I'm right here." A ghost of his familiar smile touched his lips. "Told you I'd come back." "Yes, you did," she agreed, walking alongside the stretcher as they moved him toward the waiting wagon. "Though I wish you'd chosen a less dramatic method." That drew a weak chuckle from him, which quickly turned into a grimace of pain. The Fort Worth doctor shot her a disapproving look. "Mrs. Ziegler, I presume," he said stiffly. "Your friend needs rest, not conversation. He's lost a significant amount of blood and the journey has been taxing." "Of course," Grace said, chastened. "I'm sorry." Patrick's fingers tightened around hers. "Not her fault, Doc," he managed. "Been thinking about seeing her since I woke up in your hospital." The doctor harumphed, but said nothing more as they loaded Patrick into the wagon. Doc Miller approached Grace as they prepared to depart. "You can come to the house in a few hours," he said kindly. "Let me get him settled and changed first. I'll send Billy to fetch you when he's ready for visitors." Grace reluctantly released Patrick's hand. "I'll be waiting," she promised him. "I know," he replied softly. "That's what got me through." The wait at Mrs. Peterson's tea shop was excruciating. Grace could barely touch the tea and scones placed before her, her stomach too knotted with anxiety to tolerate food. When Billy Miller finally appeared at the door, she nearly knocked over her chair in her haste to follow him. At the doctor's house, she was shown into a small, clean bedroom where Patrick lay propped against several pillows. He looked marginally better than he had at the station. Someone had helped him shave and change into a clean nightshirt, but the gray pallor of his skin and the lines of pain around his mouth told their own story. "You came," he said as she entered, his eyes brightening. "Of course I came." Grace sat in the chair beside the bed, taking his hand again. It felt cooler than it should, the strong fingers unnaturally limp in hers. "How are you feeling?" "Truly, like I've been trampled by a buffalo," he admitted. "But I've had worse. The sheriff said you were shot twice." Patrick nodded slightly. "Ambushed near the Red River. Should have seen it coming, but I was distracted." "Distracted by what?" Grace asked. His eyes met hers steadily. "Thoughts of a certain rancher and her 2 children, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life by riding away." Grace's heart leapt. "And had you?" "Yes," he said simply. "I knew it before I'd gone 10 miles, but I'm a stubborn man. Thought I should at least finish the job I'd promised to do. And now, Patrick shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. Now I'm wondering if it's too late to see if that reason to stay is still being offered. In answer, Grace leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a gentle kiss that nonetheless conveyed all the longing and hope she'd been harboring since his departure. When she pulled back, his eyes were wide with surprise and something that looked very much like joy. "I'll take that as a yes," he whispered. Grace laughed softly, wiping away the tears that had spilled onto her cheeks. "Yes, Patrick Redmond, the offer stands." She squeezed his hand. "But you have to promise me something, anything. No more tracking outlaws, no more putting yourself in the line of fire. I can't bear to see you like this again." Patrick's expression grew serious. "It's all I've known for years, Grace. I'm not sure what else I would do." "You could help me run the ranch," she suggested. "It's too much for me alone, and it's going to get harder as Daniel and Emma grow older and need more of my attention." She paused, then added, "And perhaps, in time, there might be other children who need attention as well." The implications of her words weren't lost on Patrick. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming it despite the pain and exhaustion. "Are you proposing to me, Grace Ziegler?" "I believe I am," she replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "Though I'd imagined doing it when you weren't flat on your back with bullet holes in you." Patrick laughed, then immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his side. "Timing was never my strong suit," he gasped. Doc Miller chose that moment to enter, frowning at Patrick's obvious discomfort. "That's enough visiting for now," he declared. "My patient needs rest." Grace stood reluctantly. "I'll come back tomorrow," she promised Patrick. "The children are eager to see you too when you're stronger." "Tomorrow," he agreed, already drifting toward sleep. "We'll talk more then." The next 3 weeks were a time of healing not just for Patrick's body, but for all of them. Grace visited daily, sometimes bringing the children for short visits once Patrick was strong enough to sit up and talk for longer periods. Daniel was fascinated by Patrick's scars and the stories behind them, carefully edited for young ears, while Emma simply climbed onto the bed and showed him her dolls, chattering about the chickens and the new calf as if he'd never been away. As Patrick regained his strength, the plans for their future took shape. He would sell his horse and equipment, keeping only what he needed for ranch work. Grace would teach him what he didn't already know about cattle raising and crop planting. They would expand the herd gradually, perhaps hire help once they were more established, and they would marry as soon as Patrick could stand at the altar without assistance. That day came in early October, when the cottonwoods along Willow Creek had turned golden, and the first cool breezes of autumn swept across the plains. The ceremony was simple, just the two of them, the children, and a few friends from town gathered in the small white church. Grace wore a new dress of deep green that matched her eyes, with Daniel proudly escorting her down the aisle while Emma scattered wildflower petals before them. Patrick stood tall and straight, though Grace could see the slight stiffness in his movements that betrayed his still healing injuries. But his eyes were clear and certain as they spoke their vows, his voice steady as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her for all the days of his life. The celebration afterward at the ranch was joyous but brief, neither Grace nor Patrick wanting a long, boisterous affair. By sunset, their guests had departed, leaving the new family alone together. After the children were tucked into bed with extra stories and reassurances that, yes, they could now officially call Patrick Pa, if they wished, the newlyweds stood on the porch overlooking their land. "Happy?" Patrick asked, his arm around Grace's waist. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Are you having any regrets? About settling down, I mean." Patrick turned her to face him, his expression serious. "Not a single one." This you, the children, this land, it's everything I never knew I wanted. He touched her cheek gently. I spent years running from place to place, never belonging anywhere. You've given me a home, Grace. And you've given us protection, security, Grace said softly. The children adore you. It's mutual, Patrick assured her. Though I have to admit, I'm looking forward to some time alone with my wife. His voice deepened on the last word, sending a shiver of anticipation through Grace. She smiled up at him. I believe that can be arranged, Mr. Redmond. Later, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, as moonlight spilled through the curtains and the distant coyotes sang to the stars, Grace lay in Patrick's arms and thought about the strange, painful journey that had brought them together. Frank's betrayal, the children's kidnapping, Patrick's near-fatal injuries, all terrible events that had somehow led to this moment of perfect contentment. What are you thinking about? Patrick murmured against her hair. How sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best, she replied. If Frank hadn't taken the children, we would have found each other some other way, Patrick interrupted gently. I believe that. Some things are meant to be. Grace smiled in the darkness, thinking of all the coincidences and choices that had brought this man to her door that fateful morning. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps some things were written in the stars long before we recognized them ourselves. I love you, Patrick Redmond, she whispered. His arms tightened around her. And I love you, Grace Redmond, now and always. Spring came early to the Texas Panhandle that year, bringing soft rains and wildflowers that carpeted the prairie in blues and yellows. The Redmond Ranch was thriving under the combined efforts of Grace and Patrick, with a larger herd of cattle, expanded vegetable gardens, and a new barn that Patrick had built with help from neighbors during the winter months. Daniel, now 7, had become his stepfather's shadow, soaking up knowledge about horses and cattle like a sponge. Emma at 5 was equally determined to be involved in everything, whether it was helping Grace with the chickens or insisting that she too could ride a big horse like Papa's. And there was a new addition to the family on the way. Grace's gently rounded belly, a source of quiet joy for both parents. The baby was due in late summer, and though Patrick fretted about Grace working too hard in her condition, she merely laughed and reminded him that women had been having babies while running ranches since the West was settled. One warm evening in May, as they sat on the porch watching Daniel and Emma chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, a rider appeared on the road leading to the ranch. Patrick tensed slightly. Old habits never entirely forgotten, but relaxed when he recognized the figure of Sheriff Wilson. "Evening, Sheriff," he called as the lawman rode into the yard. "What brings you out our way?" Sheriff Wilson dismounted, tipping his hat to Grace. "Mrs. Redmond, you're looking well." "Thank you," Grace replied, one hand resting protectively on her belly. "Can I offer you some coffee? Or perhaps something stronger?" "Coffee would be welcome," the sheriff said. "And perhaps a word with your husband." Grace glanced between the men, noting the serious expression on the sheriff's face. "I'll put the kettle on," she said, rising. "Children, come help me find some cookies for the sheriff." Once Grace and the children had gone inside, Patrick gestured for the sheriff to take a seat. "What's this about, Wilson?" The older man sat heavily, sighing as he removed his hat. "Got word today from the territorial prison. Frank Ziegler was killed in a fight with another inmate 2 days ago." Patrick absorbed the news silently. Frank had served nearly a year of his 5-year sentence, with no attempt to contact Grace or the children during that time. "Does Grace need to know?" he finally asked. Sheriff Wilson shrugged. "Legally, no, but I figured you'd want to be the one to tell her, rather than have her hear it as gossip in town." Patrick nodded, thinking of the complex emotions this news would stir in his wife. Despite everything Frank had done, he was still the father of her children, her first husband, a man she had once loved enough to follow across the country and build a life with. "I appreciate you riding out," he said. "I'll tell her tonight, after the children are asleep." The sheriff stood, settling his hat back on his head. "Sorry to bring bad news. How's ranch life treating you? Never thought I'd see the day when Patrick Redmond hung up his tracking gear for a plow." Patrick smiled, looking out over the land that had become his home. "Best decision I ever made." After the sheriff departed, declining the offered coffee with a promise to return another time for a proper visit, Patrick joined his family in the kitchen. Grace gave him a questioning look over the children's heads, but he shook his head slightly, indicating they would talk later. That night, after Daniel and Emma were tucked into bed, Patrick and Grace sat before the dying fire in the main room. He took her hand gently and told her the news about Frank. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her face pensive in the firelight. "I don't know what to feel," she admitted finally. "Relief that he can never threaten us again. Sadness for the man I once knew. Grief for the children who will never know their father as he once was. All of those feelings are valid," Patrick said, squeezing her hand. "You don't have to choose just one. What will we tell Daniel and Emma?" She wondered. "The truth, when they're old enough to understand it," Patrick suggested. "That their father was a complicated man who made some terrible choices, but that doesn't erase the good in him, or the fact that he gave us two extraordinary children." Grace leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "How did I find someone so wise beneath all that trail dust?" Patrick chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Not wisdom, just hard-won experience in understanding that people rarely fit into neat categories of good or bad." They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching the embers glow and fade. "I've been thinking," Grace said eventually. "If this baby is a boy, I'd like to name him after my father, William." "William Redmond," Patrick tested the name. "Strong name for a strong boy." "And if it's a girl," Grace continued, "I thought perhaps Sarah after your mother." Patrick looked at her in surprise. "You do that, of course," she said simply. "She raised a remarkable son. Her memory deserves to be honored." He kissed her then, overwhelmed by the generosity of her spirit, the way she continually found new ways to show her love. When they finally went to bed, Grace fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the emotional day and the demands of her pregnancy. But Patrick lay awake, thinking about the strange turns life could take. 3 years ago, he had been a solitary man, moving from town to town, hiring out his gun and tracking skills to whoever paid the most. He had few friends, no home, and little hope for a different future. Now he was a husband, a father to 2 children with another on the way, a rancher with land and responsibilities and community ties. All because a desperate mother had needed someone to find her stolen children, and he had happened to be in the right place at the right time. Sometimes, Patrick reflected as he drifted toward sleep with Grace's warm body nestled against his, the most important journeys weren't measured in miles across the prairie, but in the distance between a lonely heart and a loving home. William Redmond arrived in late August, a robust baby with his mother's green eyes and a tuft of dark hair that promised to be as unruly as his father's. Daniel and Emma were fascinated by their new brother, constantly wanting to hold him and help care for him, though Emma was occasionally heard to complain that he wasn't much fun yet, since all he did was sleep and cry. Life settled into a new rhythm for the family, centered around the needs of the baby but still flowing with the seasons and demands of ranch life. Patrick proved to be a natural father, as patient with William's midnight cries as he was with Daniel's endless questions and Emma's dramatic declarations. By William's first birthday, the The Redmond Ranch had become one of the more prosperous operations in the area, with Patrick's hard work and Grace's skilled management creating a sustainable and growing business. They had hired 2 hands to help with the expanded herd and were considering purchasing the adjacent property when its elderly owner decided to move east to live with his daughter. One crisp October morning, as the family sat down to breakfast, a knock came at the door. Patrick answered it to find a young boy of about 12, dusty from the trail and clearly exhausted. "Mr. Redmond?" the boy asked nervously. "The tracker." Patrick glanced back at Grace, who had risen from the table with William on her hip. "I used to be," he confirmed. "What can I do for you, son?" "My pa sent me," the boy said, standing straighter. "Indians took my little sister 2 days ago. Comanche, pa thinks. Sheriff can't spare men to go after her, and pa's laid up with a broken leg from the attack." He swallowed hard. "They say you're the best tracker in these parts. Pa says he'll pay whatever you ask if you'll find Mary." Patrick felt a familiar tension rise in his shoulders, the old instinct to saddle up and ride out immediately warring with his promise to Grace never to put himself in danger again. "Where's your place?" he asked, buying time to think. 20 miles north near Cripple Creek," the boy replied. "I'm Jimmy Carson. Pa's homestead is just past the old mission ruins." Patrick nodded. "Go on inside, Jimmy. My wife will get you something to eat while I think on this." As the boy went to the table, where Grace immediately began filling a plate for him, Patrick stepped onto the porch, needing a moment alone. He had known this day might come when his old skills would be needed, when saying no would mean condemning someone else to suffering. Grace joined him a few minutes later, leaving the children inside with their guest. "You want to go," she said. It wasn't a question. Patrick turned to her, conflict evident in his face. "I promised you I wouldn't." "You promised you wouldn't track outlaws or put yourself in unnecessary danger," Grace corrected. "This is different. This is a child who needs help." She touched his arm gently. "I know what it's like to have your children taken. I can't wish that on another mother." "It could be dangerous," Patrick warned. "The Comanche aren't known for their hospitality to white men entering their territory." "Then take Miguel with you," Grace suggested, referring to one of their hired hands, a skilled horseman and former cavalry scout. "And promise me you'll be careful." Patrick studied her face, marveling at the woman he'd married. "You're remarkable, you know that. Most wives would be begging their husbands to stay home." Grace smiled slightly. "I'm not most wives, and you're not most husbands. Your skills are a gift, Patrick. Using them to help others isn't something I could ask you to give up entirely." Her expression grew serious. "But I expect you to come back to us, whole and healthy." Patrick pulled her into his arms, mindful of the baby between them. "I will, I promise." 2 hours later, Patrick rode out with Miguel, leaving behind a tearfully grateful Jimmy Carson who would stay at the ranch until their return. Grace stood on the porch with the children, William balanced on her hip, as the 2 men disappeared over the ridge. "Will Papa find the little girl?" Emma asked, her small face concerned. "If anyone can, it's your father," Grace assured her. "He's very good at finding people who are lost." Daniel nodded confidently. "He found us when we were lost," he reminded his sister. "And he always says finding things is just a matter of knowing how to read the signs." Grace smiled down at her son, thinking how much he had come to resemble Patrick in his mannerisms and expressions, despite their lack of blood connection. "That's right, Daniel. Your papa is the best tracker in Texas. He'll bring Mary home." 5 days later, as Grace was hanging laundry on the line while William napped in a basket nearby, Daniel's shout from the pasture made her turn sharply. "Riders coming, Mama, it's Papa." Grace shaded her eyes against the midday sun, her heart leaping at the sight of 4 figures approaching Patrick and Miguel. accompanied by a man with a splinted leg riding double with a small girl perched before him. She gathered William and hurried to meet them, Emma and Daniel running ahead across the pasture. As they drew closer, she could see that Patrick looked exhausted but uninjured, his face sunburned but whole. The reunion was joyous, with Mary Carson clinging to her father while Jimmy practically danced with relief around their horse. After ensuring everyone was settled in the house with food and drink, Grace finally got Patrick alone in their bedroom, where he was washing away the trail dust. "What happened?" she asked, sitting on the edge of the bed as he dried his face. "Found them camped near the Canadian River," Patrick said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Small hunting party, not a war band. They'd taken Mary but hadn't harmed her seemed more curious than anything else. Their leader spoke some English, enough for us to negotiate." He smiled faintly. "Cost me my silver pocket watch and Miguel's fancy spurs, but they let us ride out peacefully with the girl." Grace's relief must have shown on her face, because Patrick sat beside her and took her hand. "I was careful, just like I promised. No heroics, no gunfights. Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for being careful, but for going at all. That family will never forget what you did for them." Patrick shrugged, uncomfortable with praise as always. "It's what anyone would have done." "No," Grace corrected him. "It's what you did, and it matters." That night, after the Carsons had departed with promises of payment once they were back on their feet, the family gathered around the fireplace as they often did in the evenings. William was already asleep in his cradle, while Daniel and Emma listened eagerly as Patrick told them a carefully edited version of his tracking adventure. As Grace watched her husband with their children, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the terrifying night when she discovered her own children missing, through the desperate search and dangerous rescue, to the slow building of trust and love between them. Life had tested them severely, but together they had emerged stronger. The man who had once believed he couldn't have a home now sat at the center of a loving family, his restless spirit finding peace in the stability he provided them. And Grace, who had once faced the prospect of raising her children alone on a struggling ranch, now shared both burdens and joys with a partner who valued her strength as much as she valued his. Outside, the Texas wind sang across the prairie, carrying the promise of change and growth. Inside, warmed by firelight and family, Grace and Patrick Redmond held tight to the precious present they had built together, their love a beacon that had guided them home through the darkest of nights. As years passed, the Redmond ranch prospered, and the family grew. Following William came two more children: Sarah, born on a snowy winter night when Patrick had to deliver her himself because the doctor couldn't make it through the drifts, and Joseph, who arrived with such haste 3 years later that Grace barely had time to call for the midwife. Daniel, as the eldest, took on increasing responsibility around the ranch, showing a natural talent for working with horses that Patrick encouraged. By 16, he was breaking mustangs that even experienced hands approached with caution, his quiet confidence with the animals reminiscent of Patrick's own. Emma, strong-willed and independent, shocked the local community by announcing her intention to attend the Teachers College in Denver when she turned 18. Patrick and Grace supported her ambition, proud of the intelligent, determined young woman she was becoming, even as they privately worried about her venturing so far from home. Life brought challenges as well as joys. A severe drought nearly ruined them the summer William turned 5, saved only by Patrick's foresight in digging additional wells the previous year. Scarlet fever swept through Amarillo when Sarah was 4, taking the lives of several children in town. Though the Redmond children were mercifully spared through it all, The bond between Grace and Patrick deepened, their partnership stronger for having weathered each storm together. The passionate attraction that had drawn them to each other in the beginning matured into a profound connection that sustained them through difficult times and enhanced the good ones. Patrick's reputation as a tracker never quite faded, and occasionally he was still called upon to help find lost children or valuable livestock, though he no longer took on dangerous assignments hunting outlaws. Instead, he focused on teaching his skills to Daniel and the younger boys, passing down knowledge that had taken him a lifetime to accumulate. Grace continued to manage the household accounts and much of the ranch business, her sharp mind for figures ensuring their continued prosperity. As the children grew old enough to take on more responsibilities, she found time to pursue interests long set aside: painting, playing the piano Patrick had surprised her with on their 5th anniversary, and writing stories that she read to the younger children at bedtime. On a golden afternoon in the autumn of their 15th year together, Grace and Patrick rode out to the highest point on their property, a small rise that offered views across the rolling grasslands to the distant mountains. They dismounted, spreading a blanket in the shade of a lone oak tree that had somehow survived countless prairie fires and storms. "I've been thinking," Patrick said as they sat side by side, watching the shadows lengthen across their land. "A dangerous pastime," Grace teased, leaning against his shoulder. He smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling, lines earned from years of squinting into the sun and, more recently, from laughter. "I've been thinking about that day I rode into Amarillo and found a desperate mother looking for her stolen children." Grace nodded, memories of that terrible time still vivid despite the years that had passed. "The worst days of my life," she said softly, "and yet they led me to you." "That's just it," Patrick said, taking her hand, his thumb tracing the simple gold band she wore. "I've spent 15 years trying to figure out why I was in that town on that particular day. What twist of fate put me in the right place at the right time to hear your story?" "And have you figured it out?" Grace asked. Patrick gazed out over the land that had become his home. "I think maybe I was always heading here," he said thoughtfully. "All those years of wandering, tracking, searching, maybe I was really looking for something I couldn't name until I found it." "And what was that?" Grace prompted, though she thought she knew the answer. "A place to belong," he said simply. "People who needed me for more than my gun or my tracking skills." He turned to look at her directly. "Someone who could see past what I did to who I was." Grace leaned forward and kissed him gently. Even after 15 years of marriage, the touch of his lips still kindled warmth within her. "I think perhaps we found each other because we both needed finding," she said when they parted. Patrick smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. "You might be right about that. The best tracker in Texas, found by the one person he wasn't looking for." As the golden light bathed the landscape in warmth, Grace thought about the twisting path that had brought them to this moment, the pain and fear that had eventually yielded to joy and security. Frank's betrayal, the children's kidnapping, Patrick's near-fatal injuries, all links in a chain that had ultimately led to this life they had built together. "I love you, Patrick Redmond," she said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them. "Thank you for finding us." "I love you too, Grace Redmond," he replied, his voice deepening with emotion. "Thank you for giving me a reason to stop running." Together they sat, watching the sun set on the land that had witnessed their journey from strangers to lovers to partners in all things. And as darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the vast Texas sky, they rode home side by side, returning to the family and the future they had created from the broken pieces of the past. The tracker who had spent his life finding others had, at last, found his way home. And the mother who had once faced the darkness alone now walked in the light of a love that had been worth every step of the difficult journey. In the end, they had found not just each other, but the peace that comes from knowing that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, two hearts beating as one beneath the endless Texas sky.